So, Dan, now that you've finished the Argonautilus series of plays, um, I wanted to ask you why. I know that you've done a lot of myths and you've done a lot of legends and sort of folk tales and what have you. So why Jason? Why the Argonauticus? Why this one and why now?
Well, I've always wanted to. One of my favorite movies growing up was Jason and the Argonauts, the Ray Harryhausen film. You
When did you
know,
see that
well,
for the first time?
I first saw it on TV, which would have I probably was 5 or 6 years old. The movie came out in like I believe 63, 65, something like that, 63,
Yeah.
64. Um, but when I was a kid, there were theaters in New York City. There were 24-hour theaters, and what would happen is overnight would be the porno. The porno would play from like midnight till 8 in the morning or 6 in the morning. From 6, 7, 8 in the morning till maybe 10 in the morning, they would replay old kids stuff, which would be old Bugs Bunny cartoons. Because in these days, you would have those old cans, and what would happen is over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, the distributors for certain movies might never come to pick up their movies after they were released, the movie release. So someone might have, in 71, 72, they might have an old can of a movie that's a decade old, and
Mhm.
they just use it as their property. They would show this. Then from like 10 to uh, noon, there might be, some real old time silent movies, or maybe they throw in some other crap, and then they would have the main features again for the main 12 hours. So when I was a kid, what would happen is to save money, a lot of these small independent theaters didn't have ushers or whatnot, but they would pay local kids. They'd give them a mop and a broom, and they'd give $2 or $3 to clean out the theater. So it might be 4 or 5 young kids sweeping up the popcorn, the dirty condoms, or whatever that might be on the floor, and dump it. And then not only would he get $2 or $3, but the guy would say, well, you guys can come in anytime you want to watch, the movies, want to watch a Bugs Bunny movie on screen. And so one of the times I remember was Jason and the Argonauts, and I remember having seen it on TV. I only had black and white TV until 1986,
Mm.
so it was a huge thing. And this was generally considered a B movie, but over the years, as I watched it a few more times uh, on DVD and whatnot, uh, it's really a good movie. I don't know if I would call it a great movie. You could say it's a great B movie, but one of the things that it does so well, aside from the Harryhausen dreamlike monsters that sort of move with the stop
Yeah.
motion, is it captures the rhythms of the original Greek myths and also the later Sinbad films. It captures it so well. You would have a brief scene, two people meet. One of them is in trouble, the other one saves it. You are my friend for life. That's all you get for that. Or
Yeah.
you would in that particular movie you have Medea and Jason. He saves her from as she's floating in on a piece of wood from her destroyed ship from the clashing rocks, that the Symplegades that go back and forth and crush ships.
Hmm.
And within five minutes of screen time, they're in love, and
Yeah.
that is so much like the Greek stuff. There's no filler; it's just pure action, pure plot driven in the best sense. And
Mm.
what makes the movie stand out are the things like the Harryhausen features, the fact that you get Hercules. In the film, it's called Hercules. I call him the original Greek Heracles. Comes in,
Yeah.
does a few things, then midway, Hercules, one of the biggest names in Greek mythology, just disappears from the movie, and he goes off on his 12 labors or 10 labors that became 12 labors. And
Yeah.
so I always wanted to do something with it, and it's just a matter of finding the form. Like I've said, and I probably told you, and I know I've done it with other people, is like it took me 20 years to get the right form for the Vincetti brothers that became a novel. And it was just feeling I'd done the Great Khans, I'd done Alexander, Cyrus, and Sargon the Great. I'd done the Arthurian stuff, and I said, well, let me do Jason and the Argonauts. So basically, what I did in the 5 plays, the first 3 plays are the Argonaut searching for the Golden Fleece. It's basically a retelling of the story from the Argonautica by Apollonius Rhodius that
Yeah.
became the basis of the movie, and then the fourth play is my rework of Medea, the play Medea, and then
Yeah.
and
That's the play by Aeschylus, isn't it?
Aeschylus, yeah, and he also Seneca did a version of it, I believe. Um,
There's been quite a few variations of that one.
and Jeffers,
So
Robinson Jeffers, most recently. And I had just come off of doing a play in the middle of these 5 plays. I was doing poet plays. So one of the poet plays was Robinson Jeffers, who did the modern adaptation of Medea. And then the final 5th play is just my dealing with Jason dealing with growing older. Because as I always like to do, I try to find the flaws in certain things and fix them. But we can talk about that as we go on.
yeah, well, there's a few things I could ask you about this. I mean, for one thing, the Harryhausen film. Um, the Harryhausen films, as you were saying, they have this kind of almost magical quality that almost invites you to sort of enter into them imaginatively. And you know, the first Harryhausen films I ever saw were the Sinbad films,
Yeah.
which I think are fantastic.
With Tom
But
Baker, the Doctor Who, Tom Baker, then before he became the Doctor.
I never realized that.
Yeah,
But
he's in it.
but also you know, I suppose the question really was, I suppose, why now of all times for the Jason and the Argonauts? Was there something that brought them to the forefront of your mind? Were you reminded of them somehow? I mean, because you've been doing quite a few of these mythic, sort of legendary sort of plays and stories and whatnot. So I suppose why now is really, was it just kind of like, well, I haven't done that yet, or was something did something kind of alert you to it?
Well, mostly that what you just said. But by the time I got to the 4th play, the Medea play, they had overturned Roe versus Wade here in the United States, making abortion illegal in more than half the states, all the red inbred states, um, and uh, and so I was like, well, I need to show that this is one. I mean, the major flaw with Medea, putting aside the Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece leading up to the Medea play, is that it never struck me as true that Medea would kill her 2 sons. Or she actually had, I think there were 3 sons in the original 2. I gave a name to the 3rd oldest boy, Thessalus, but it never struck me as true. If she was going to lash out at Jason, that would be the last thing it would do. And what it does, it takes an up to then character that you're sympathetic to and makes a double murderess of her own children, which then flips it on Jason. And there's only one reason that the Greeks who would do that, Aeschylus, these were all men. And so in their minds, even though Aeschylus or Seneca or anyone who's writing these plays probably didn't recognize it, but that's a typical male thing to do. Let's blame the woman, even though Jason is clearly the bad guy in the play, or one of the bad guys. But let's flip it at the end and make Medea bad. And so Medea is, along with Lady not Hamlet, Lady Macbeth, one of the 2 great supposed evil women of drama.
Yeah.
And it just never sat well with me. So in that particular 4th play, that was one of the things to give her a more realistic reason for what she does.
Yeah, I suppose the Argonauticus is quite a strange sort of Homeric sort of myth in that sense. Sort of classical scholars, it's not very popular with them.
Yes, and there's a I think a basic reason for that. You've got the Iliad, the Odyssey, you've got the Aeneid. They're the big 3 of Greek epoche. But Lucan's The Civil War is just as good. I haven't read it for many years, but I remember it being good. Maybe I'll have to redo that at some point too. And then the Argonauticus.
You turned me on to Lucan in that respect. But the Argonauticus, it seems very weird. In preparation for this, I was sort of skimming through it and trying to read some academe about it. I mean, it has this episodic quality. It's a lack of characterization. It's sort of a tendency towards digression, and scholars seem to say that the dramatically resonant part of it is the Medea, whole vengeance plot. But again, it has the same kind of superficiality. I mean, even now, kind of, there's this, I suppose, a whole feminist critique of, Medea. I mean, as you're alluding to, I suppose, kind of, is that a really fair thing to sort of, it doesn't seem to have a lot of realism to it, but yeah.
I was recently interviewing a guy. In fact, my last interview that I did last week, a guy who's a sci-fi writer and a YouTuber, and I think it was in that interview, or maybe one I did with Alex Sheremet, that his thing went down. We got to redo it. His internet went down. But I was talking about. Have you ever heard of Julian Jaynes?
Yes, he wrote the Bicameral Mind.
Yeah. So one of the things that is at the basis of his belief is that up until between 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, that human beings were not sentient, meaning that they were basically glorified zombies. And one of the bases that Jaynes used for this is ancient texts, whether it was Gilgamesh, whether it was
yes. I seem to recall him saying that people would have temporal cross chatter, that we lacked some sort of integral part of our brains, and that this cross chatter would be experienced as the voice of the gods.
But more cogent to getting back to the Medea thing is these guys who are writing this could make all of these, a character could be going in this particular direction and then all of a sudden make a U-turn, which wouldn't happen in real life, but it could be justified with that Jaynesian view of a lack of a deeper sentience, because they are just playthings, and human beings will playthings of the gods, the characters will playthings of the author, and so on and so forth.
This is a very controversial theory, though, Dan, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, I don't buy it, but that is one of the things that Jaynes based his theory on in looking at ancient texts. And part of the problem is, like many people who are not creative and who simply have a scientific mindset, is they don't basically understand creativity, or something that you can just imagine things.
Yeah.
In modern day times, we have the exact opposite. Is that, oh my God, you are a gay Briton. You couldn't possibly understand what it's like to be, Laotian Buddhist or whatnot, because you're not that. Well, you can actually think about it. You have an imagination. Maybe you could paint from that point of view, or I can write from that point of view. But there's always this stuff, whether it's old dead white men like Julian Jaynes or modern PC elitists that don't think that look at things, look at their flaws, and instead of just saying, well, it's just flawed because they weren't as good at writing 3,000-4,000 years ago, it must have been something wrong with their brains. No, just like in 5,000 years, if humanity survives, there'll be people that'll be so far beyond me or Picasso or Shakespeare or Kubrick in their various forms and art forms yet to be thought of. It's not that we're lacking, it's just we're not there yet.
It could also be just typical sort of chauvinism in some respect, Dan, too, because Medea, not only is she a woman, she's a foreigner, isn't she? She's
Colchis,
an African.
Yeah, basically, Jason is from the province of Thessaly and the city of Iolcus, where his lineage rules, and then they go through the Sea of Marmara, through the Dardanelles, and the Ponto, what's it called, between Turkey and whatever it's called, and then across the Black Sea, then called the Inhospitable Sea. It's the Black Sea, where now Georgia exists. That's where Colchis, the land. So and in fact, Medea is considered a national heroine in Georgia, the state. I should say the country, not the U.S. state.
But it's like you were alluding to. There's this sort of curious superficiality to the Argonauticus, which people have always quite struggled with. I mean, it has a kind of almost a sort of ironical quality to it. I mean, like again, this lack of characterization, a lack of dramatic tension. I mean, the episodes with the gods are quite interesting because they have this sort of banal domestic style. You know, gods getting in squabbles about things.
And that's for me my favorite part of the Harryhausen film is the portrayal of Hera and Zeus, which is why I bring Hera and Zeus as played by my doppelganger character and the character that's the actors there to give commentary. So you get different layers of commentary. You have the characters self-reflecting. I mean, in the very first of the plays, the characters are wondering, are there really gods? Heracles, and Theseus are openly, agnostic or worse. Jason, it seems that God worship is on the outs if we're to go by that first play.
I mean, there's also, I think, you have a tendency to, as it were, attempt to inject realism into these myths. And it seems that from some of the academics that I've been reading, like that the Argonauticus itself was representative of a kind of move towards realism, maybe perhaps realism as they conceived it, which perhaps might read quite awkwardly to us now. But it's a strange sort of realism too. It's a conflicted sort of realism, and I suppose there's also sort of this conflict that plays out in other various works by you of a conflict between determinism and how shall we say, predestination, free will and determinism. Like, are we really in control of our fates? Are we puppets of the gods? Etc. etc. I mean, and you seem to, from our conversations, get into quite a lot of arguments with people about the nature of free will, and this seems to be represented by Jason sort of struggling with his the prophecy of his rise to heroism, but also his death.
Yeah. Well, let me give you an example. I recently, just 3 or 4 days ago, watched. There's I don't know if you ever heard of it. There's a YouTube channel called Cinema Cartography.
I've not heard of that, I'm afraid.
It's a British guy, and I think his Polish or Russian wife, Eastern European wife, and they're wannabe filmmakers, and they're very hit and miss. But they started a series on cinema from the earliest going, and they contrast the early films of Thomas Edison with the Lumiere Brothers in France, and they talk about how Edison maximized films for their financial gain by having people basically do vaudeville acts. It was total fiction, whereas the Lumiere brothers were more popular in Europe because one of their very first films was, workers leaving the Lumiere factory because they owned a factory that did regular photography, still photography, and then they were getting into film. And it became a sensation. It's only like a 35, 40-second film from like 1896 or 7 or something like that, with women and then men and then a dog and a few other things, a truck coming out of the factory. But it was real. And what it did was it broadened the sense of what was real, even though it was very pedestrian. And then one of their later films, a year or two later, they had the revolutionary idea of showing waves coming into Dover Cliff or something. And then they made a cut. They cut to the waves then going up a river or something. And so people were just astonished in the late 1890s by the realism as was seen. Now we look at that and we're like, okay, it's like watching a bug crawl across the sand. It's like, okay, but then it was revolutionary. And in the same way, when you're bringing up the Argonautica, compared to Iliad, compared to Aeneid, compared to the Odyssey, which is basically, you could call it cultural dick waving, the Argonautica and the Civil War and other things from that era are seemingly more realistic because they don't necessarily go into, Jason is the hero of that poem, that work, but
he doesn't really do much.
Yeah, and he's not the figure of Achilles. He's not the figure of Odysseus. Yeah. So
Yeah, he doesn't really do much. A lot of the except for kind of even in sort of the later episodes, that's kind of more Medea's story, and
yeah.
the earlier ones we have, as you were saying, Heracles and Theseus and all these other characters.
But one of the reasons is that the reader then, or the listener, if they were listening to this poem being read aloud, could probably identify more with Jason. Jason, not that he was an everyman, because he was of royal birth and all, but Jason was a more everyman character than Odysseus, than Theseus. You know, Theseus, he killed the Minotaur with his bad hand. Heracles did all sorts of amazing feats. Odysseus, you know, goes on a 20-year voyage and comes back. You know, so Jason, in this sense, all he basically did was cross an ocean and steal you know, a national treasure, which,
Yeah.
relatively speaking, people then probably could relate to that a bit more than being, oh, Heracles, you know, Atlas, Heracles, can you uphold the sky while I take a whiz or something? You know, Heracles was a few notches above. You know, it would be the difference between comparing, say, Batman to whoever the supreme being is in the DC Comics universe. There's you know, you have Superman and the Martian Manhunter or whatever the other characters in between. So Jason was closer to that level that people could probably slip their shoes into, the way, you know, a Batman or maybe a Spider-Man might be.
It makes me think now. I really want to see a Dan Schneider does the Justice League, you know, or Dan Schneider does the Avengers. I mean, I wonder what that would look like. But yeah, I mean, it's there is a kind of strangeness, sort of an unresolvedness, perhaps an unresolvedness to the story that I think writers over the centuries have been attempting to work out for themselves. I mean, we've mentioned a few of these people, such as Jeffers, even Harryhausen, and Pasolini even did a Medea film. So I suppose, like, where did, you know, how did this remake take form in your mind? Like, where did you know that you should start?
Well, I mean, you basically start with Jason. Jason is the only character that appears in all 5 plays. Of the major characters, Jason's in all 5. Acastus and his father Peleus. Acastus is in the first 3. Acastus is the villain in the Golden Fleece tale, basically. Peleus, and what I did, I made Peleus the good king, and I made Jason and his father the bad kings. I switched that around because it makes more sense. Medea appears in at the end of play 2. She's in 3 and 4, and she appears as a silent ghost in 5. Heracles is in 1 and 2, and then he's a ghost in 5. Theseus is in 1, 2, and 3, and then in 5 he's a ghost. So of the major characters, there's only Jason that's in all of them, and he's sometimes arguably not the main character. You know, there are interesting developments of other characters, but I started with the basic myth that he was taken away after Peleus took over. But instead of the old myth where Peleus usurps the good king Aeetes, it's Peleus who's taking over. He's the man of the people, a king of the people who's beloved, because Aeetes, not Aeetes, I'm sorry, Aeson is Jason's father, and he's the bad king. And so Jason comes back, and there's the idea of the man with one sandal, and this is how they know. Hera, I believe, tells Peleus that his reign will end when the man with one sandal comes. We see that at the beginning. Acastus befriends Jason, but he's working an angle, and Acastus is even working an angle against his father, which is a good thing that we don't have in the original, is that Acastus is sent onto the Argo to be Peleus's eyes and ears without Jason knowing it. He doesn't know the connection. But here, Acastus is working his own angles. He wants to basically usurp his father, we find out in later plays. So by doing these little tweaks to the characters and their relations and how they do that, I think you get a much more natural flow. Because throughout this play, you've got scheming dads. You've got Peleus, who's the best of them. You've got Aeetes, who's the father of Medea. And you got Aeson, who's the father of Jason. and
Mm.
they're all at some point trying to pull strings. Jason himself becomes a bad king and a bad father to his own children by the end. So
this is a theme you've kind of explored in other plays as well, sort of the lineage and sort of sons turning into their fathers, as it were, in the the Khan plays. But as Hera's an interesting one too. I mean, even in the original myth, it's not often that we see Hera displayed as a kind of a virtue, as a good character. Often she's a really angry bitch, and but in this one she's the patron of the heroes. Although one could say that this is only because she has an animus. She wants to right a wrong that she feels has been done to her. But she appears in all the plays as well, I believe.
Yeah, okay. Jason, I should have said of the mortals. Hera and Zeus appear in all the plays too, but sometimes they have whole scenes where they talk. In one, I think in the fourth play or maybe the last play, they only have a brief interaction.
Yeah, she's still a quite interesting character, like Hera, as you've written her. I think a lot of the scenes between Hera and Jason are probably my favorite of the cycle, and I think the scenes between Hera and Zeus are interesting, but I think some of the most interesting philosophical conversations, as it were, play out between Jason and Hera, which have to do with, I suppose, all the things that we've been alluding to, the idea of predestination and heroism, and I suppose even the nature of myth. What the fuck is the point of myths and their retelling?
Well, Jason starts in the first play. He's doubting everything because he knows, he's been told, presumably off stage before the play begins, he knows that he's going to end up dying on the Argo when a piece of the mast, a rotted piece of wood, falls on him and kills him. So it's one of those things. Well, what should I? Okay, I'm going to become famous as an adventurer. I'm going to become a king. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. But at the end, I'm still going to die a very ignominious death. And he, in a sense, he's jealous to a certain degree of both Theseus, who later becomes an Argonaut, and in the Argonautica, I don't think Theseus is part of the Argos there, but I put him in because in other tales he is. It's just like with King Arthur, there are many different versions of whatnot. So I took the ones that are the best. So I put Theseus there because here then you have the three greatest heroes before the Trojan War. You have Theseus, Heracles, and Jason all on the same ship. And Jason basically becomes the captain because he doesn't get famous until afterwards, until he brings back the Golden Fleece. Basically he's in charge of the two. It's sort of like if this was a movie, you have some schlemiel as the main hero of the movie, and meanwhile you've got Brad Pitt and George Clooney as Theseus and Heracles, and
it's the golden age of heroes, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing too, like about the classical period. This whole idea of the golden age. I mean, it's a fairly recent thing that we have this idea of historical locomotion, as it were. That things are getting better, whereas in the classical world, it was this sense that all the great absolutely titanic heroic stuff had already come before, and that things actually might be getting worse.
Well, it's also a thing of cycles, because in the Greek classical world, it's similar to the Norse myths in that the Greeks start out with nothingness. Then I think I forget which of the original powers of the universe are then they give birth to the Cyclops, to the Titans, to I think the Perseids or what, and so anyway, then the Titans displace. I think it's Gaia and maybe Chaos are the two original.
I think
they are displaced by the Titans. The king of the Titans is it's Kronos. And Uranus. Uranus, which became the planet Uranus. Uranus is the guy who's the grandfather of everyone. Kronos is his son, which is the equivalent of Saturn. Saturn then gets the idea that his kids are going to usurp him, so he eats his first 6 kids, first 5 or 6 kids, which includes Hera, and then Zeus is the 6th one. He's raised away, very much like Jason is, and then comes back and pulls his his siblings out of. He marries his sister Hera. He constantly cheats on her. Jason later. So in a sense, the whole Jason Medea thing is the mortal version of Zeus and Hera.
Mm. I didn't think of it like that. I mean, yeah, that's interesting. I think it's also quite funny as well, or rather, it's apt, I suppose, that Zeus, as you portray him, is kind of a bit of a horn dog. I mean, he's he's the kind of this impish, horny guy. I mean, because essentially that's how I think of Zeus as a god, who basically he's like the god of not being able to keep it in his pants.
But I do the one thing I do that breaks the fourth wall there is the Zeus and Hera are portrayed by Danny and the actor's character, and Zeus is said to be wearing his eyeglasses or my eyeglasses. So we have the oddity of an ancient god that's wearing eyeglasses, but of course they talk about the past and the future too. So they're going back and forth, shuttling between thousands of years, and
the omniscience of the gods compared to the omniscience of the author, as it were.
Yeah, and that's another comparison. You know, which is the progenitor? Who is the progenitor of who? And it's been established in earlier plays, including some of the poet plays and a handful of plays beforehand, that the Danny Wagner character is a father-like figure to the Chloe actress character, but yet in the play they're playing lovers. And I think Zeus, Danny as Zeus, says something like, "Isn't that Greek of me? You know, to have the father-daughter figures of earlier plays become lover figures in another play."
Is it Chloe? Is it who the actress character?
Maybe it's her that says it. I don't recall, but it was
well,
a
no,
good line.
I mean, is it Chloe? Is the name of the actress character?
Yeah, the actress character is Chloe, who plays Hera, and also plays Medea. And that was another thing I did by having the actress character play the two antagonistic females in Jason's life.
Yes. I see what you mean now about them being almost like mortal counterparts for the gods, in the sense that Chloe would play both Medea and Hera.
Yeah. And
I suppose it doesn't also help to disprove the theory that you have a god complex, that you have your fictive analog playing Zeus as well, because you play your fictive analog stands in for other gods in other plays that you've done, such as in the Arthur cycle, he plays Fire Eyes, you know, the sort of demiurgic god that Merlin worships.
I've read too much Pirandello, I guess.
Yeah, but you know, I suppose this whole thing about sort of retelling myths. I mean, I suppose you could say that myths are supposed to be retold, or kind of that's the whole point about myths. I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, obviously, I mean, you have this, and this is one of the things, though, that. And I mentioned the superhero characters. One of the things that I find wrong with major superhero comic strips is they, in a sense, because we know, I think it's Siegel and Schuster created Superman. Bob Kane and Bill Finger created Batman. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, I think, are what created Spider-Man. They have definite places of origins. Yeah. I don't think that they make good analogs for modern gods, because. And that's what I did that whole book on, you know, the superhero with the, you know,
well, Jack Kirby would actually model his heroes off like Thor, right?
Yeah, but their reason dead for why Thor is there is that they're actually aliens. That the Norse gods were actually aliens of some sort. So
it's this whole chariot of the gods bullshit, isn't it?
Yeah, basically. But the thing with retelling the myths is you sort of have to do it. You know, because we don't know where the myths come from, because myths come from the mists of time. It's better to retell them over and over again, and it's sort of the eternal cycle of these myths. You know, Ragnarok. And then, you know, what's the great tree of life in Norse myth rises again.
Yggdrasil.
You know, Yggdrasil, Yggdrasil, whatever you want to call it. Or then, you know, whichever Hindu god it is, you know, the flower all is coming from the navel to reset these things. The problem with a lot of the superhero characters is because we know that Superman was created in 38, Batman in 39, Spider-Man in 62 or 63, whenever it was. You get these constant things where every 15, 20 years they reset the thing. And so Peter Parker or Clark Kent, who probably would have been born on, what is it, Krypton in 1920 or whatever it would have been, is still young 100 years later. And that loses it. What they should do, if I was doing a comic book, not that I'm interested, but if I was ever to do a comic book, I'd say you have to let Batman age and then a new Batman come, or someone display it. That's more realistic for that, because you don't have the true mists of time. No one ever believed in Superman as a god. No one ever believed in Iron Man as a god. But they did believe in Hera. There were cults of Hera. I was even watching an excellent little video about Aphrodite and how Aphrodite changed from Ishtar to Astarte to Aphrodite, and then how Aphrodite broke into 3 different goddesses, and then became Venus. And so there, it's more organic. The belief system that people actually believed in is more organic than when you have a specific creator. And I think that's a major flaw of comic books today. But
well, only if you believe, and there are some who genuinely do state, Grant Morrison is one of them, that these pop cultural figures are a kind of substitute for a kind of a modern mythology, a modern mythopoetic structure. But I always feel that this is a bit of a that this is mistaken, or this is slightly wrong.
For me, it's like someone playing with toy soldiers and trying to pretend they're George Patton. I mean, they're still toy soldiers. They're not the real thing.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, though, it becomes interesting to see how with various authors and poets, as it were, when they take these mythic structures, what happens in that adaptation, what happens in the retelling. They can be, I suppose, informative illustrations of sort of the place and time. I mean, so for instance, I mean, Ray Harryhausen with him, and it's almost like the Jason and the Argonauts story becomes almost like a magical toy theater, as it were, this sort of like dreamlike toy theater. Whereas I suppose if I were to essentialize for a moment in your plays, it's almost like it becomes a didactic theater of competing value systems, as it were. The modern and the ancient, the personal free will and sort of mythic fate, as it were. And I think there's an interesting element in sort of like the travestying of the legend, sort of the deliberate sort of deforming of the legend, as it were, sort of like, as you were saying, sort of this organic change that comes about with the retelling of myths over time. I suppose I read a quote by C.S. Lewis a while ago where he said some myths don't have a story at all. And it seems to be that kind of that's really kind of, that would almost be quite tantalizing to an author or a poet to, as it were, have a kind of clean slate, a kind of clean space to come in and really kind of do what he wants to do with all these sort of figures and such.
It's a great missed opportunity. If I think of an, I'm not an expert in Arthurian lore, but I mean, the closest thing in the last 30, 40 years would be Marion Zimmer Bradley's retake on King Arthur. And the few books that she does, I mean, it's pretty good. I mean, I disagree with some of her portrayals and stuff, but like I in there with Arthurian stuff, why do you need Tristram? Why do you need Lancelot when you got Sir Gawain, who's for me a much more powerful, much more mythic, much more organic figure? Here in the same way, to me, Jason, if I talked about him being a more everyman character than Odysseus or Heracles or Theseus, because he is that everyman character, you should humanize him more. I wasn't going to try to push him to say, okay, Jason is in the same league with those other heroes. You know, one's a demigod in Heracles. Theseus technically would be a demigod, but he's not usually viewed at that. He's viewed as the more mortal half. He doesn't ascend like Heracles after Heracles dies and ascends and becomes a full-fledged god. And Odysseus, you know, has this great background, basically the equivalent of World War II 4,000 years ago. You know, he's the whole Trojan War was their world war at that time. And from what I know, there really was a Trojan War, and these myths came out of that. But Jason is basically an adventure story. And so how do we make Jason more interesting? How do we, you know, well, he's not super competent. He's not the brightest guy. But he's trying, and his failures are things that are more relatable than anything Heracles could do. You know, Heracles can change the course of a river, for God's sakes. He can hold up the whole firmament of heaven. You know.
Yeah, and in the last play, he becomes a quite brooding figure. I suppose in the last play and in the Medea play, Jason is quite a brooding figure, I suppose, or almost like an Oedipal kind of figure.
Well, he at some point he thinks he's insane. He thinks that Hera is a delusion, and she may very well be. I mean, I think I have a scene where the gods Zeus and Hera are worrying about, you know, human beings losing faith in them, and that their existence depends on being believed in, which is something that's not unique to this play. There are other works off the top of my head I can't think of. I know there are other films and stuff where gods depend on. There's this cyclic thing where the essence of the gods depends on belief.
Recent sort of trashy film. I mean, they did a remake of Clash of the Titans recently, and that was a big theme in that. Like, the humans are losing faith and whatnot.
Okay, yeah. But the end of the first play, and we'll take a break here because we're about 40 minutes in. The end of the first play, you know, they're off for their adventure, and then basically plays 2 and 3 basically are the bulk of what's the Harryhausen film.
I suppose that, you know, this is you've made quite a few plays by now, and quite a few of these mythic plays, and the Jason cycle the Argonauticus, as you've named it, which I feel is actually a lovely name. But the Argonauticus doesn't strike me as shall we say, you don't make any particular stylistic gains in this cycle, I would say. You're not kind of doing any real creative pyrotechnics compared to some of those. I mean, I would even say in the Arthurian plays, we have a bit more kind of, a term people like to use is sort of metatextual or intertextuality. I mean, there's not so much of that in these plays, and there are some kind of temporal displacements here and there, but it seems like you've gotten quite into the swing of these kind of mythic plays by now, that you're in a place almost, as it were, of kind of comfort. And I was just wondering, you know, like, have you kind of settled into a kind of rhythm here with these things? Like, I know you do you're doing a whole bunch of different stuff in tandem. So you're doing your poets plays and whatnot at the same time, or rather intermittently. You'll work on one play and then another play. But it feels like you've gotten really into a rhythm here with making these plays. And I'm wondering, like, are you becoming a bit more too comfortable, perhaps?
Well, that's why I changed things up. The last couple of days, I've been working on my follow-up book on my cat, Cabiria, the one that I'm looking for you to, once I get it done, maybe do 8 or 10 pictures of drawings or whatnot. Yeah, you always have to go, and that's one of the reasons to go back and forth, to cross-pollinate. But I mean, there has to be a certain cohesion if you're doing 5 plays. I can't have Jason, you know, veering wildly in one play, unless the only way that could work is if one play was told, say, all the way from Acastus's point of view or Medea's point of view, and their Jason might be more monstrous to them. But since this is basically following Jason, and Jason is the central character, there has to be some consistency. Now, if you compare him to King Arthur, Jason is, I think, I have one of the scenes in one of the plays of the King Arthur plays where King Arthur is basically cool with Guinevere fucking around because that gives him the moral reason to fuck around, and he doesn't care. And Jason is again, he's more of an everyman. He worries about things. He worries about his reputation. He worries about initially doing right or whatnot. He seems to get more bitter and get more jaded as the play goes on, which is a natural progression since the first 3 plays are set over several months. Then the Medea play is set 10 or 12 years later, and then 20 or 30 years after that is the final play. So there has to be some kind of progression of the characters. But no, you never want to get too comfortable. I mean, I've got other plays for ideas, where I'm going to do more, I did so many plays that were based on my life early on, and people, you could get sick of them, and I got sort of sick of them too. And so now I'm doing, mythic plays. I still have some plays to do on historical figures. The poet plays are interesting to do because, for example, I've done 4 poet plays. 3 of them are rather nasty people: Stevens, Jeffers, and Edna St. Vincent Millay. The only the poet play that I've done with a likable lead character is the Hazel Hall play. She's a paraplegic. So, there's
a more sympathetic character, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I mean that, like, it feels that, like, where we are retreading, if we're reading kind of your works chronologically, at least, that we're retreading some familiar ground, especially in those conversations between father and sons, especially like kings and their sons. A lot of the conversations that we're reading are reminiscent of conversations from the plays with Sargon and the plays with who's the other one? Forgive me. Sargon and what was the other? Yeah, I mean, this whole question of duty, as it were, and what have you. But I suppose the one that really kind of stands out to me and was perhaps my favorite, and maybe even predictably, is the Medea one. If only, like, that's perhaps the most melodramatic, quote unquote, in that with the murder of infants and accusations and and what have you. I suppose the thing about that play, to me, that's quite striking is the kind of the heightened emotion that you're dealing with in those sort of scenes, and whereas in the other ones, in the other plays, there's a bit more of a cooler sensibility at work, even in all the scenes, really, a more kind of sense of detachedness. Whereas the Medea play does have more of those that kind of hot emotionality coming through, which you would expect.
That's in the latter half of that play. If you look at the beginning of that play, what I do is I hark back a little bit to the Dagonet character from the Arthurian plays. Dagonet was the court fool who ends up in love with Guinevere. Here,
the comedy of the assassins.
Right. Well, not only the comedy of the assassins, but the play opens up with a lengthy sort of Abbott and Costello routine between Jason the king, who's sort of off his rocker and if not actively insane, he's going senile, and one of his royal assistant, Thaddeus, who he keeps mistaking as Theseus because it's one letter off. So you have this whole thing. No, I'm not Theseus. I'm Thaddeus. And they go back and forth, and he keeps, and even in the final play, he forgets the name of the character, and so the Jason is set up as more. He's more a foolish character by that time because he knows he's getting closer to his death. He knows from Hera, who he has shut out of his life and hasn't seen by that point. Hera plays a role in the first 3 plays, and then in the last 2 plays, she's sort of shut out before she has a final scene with Jason. And so he's sort of, all over the place. And the irony is, we always have in the background of these plays, and especially in the Medea play, and I highlight this far more than any of the other Medea plays, is that it seems like the Trojan War is only maybe a few months or a few years off, because there seem to be machinations on the outside that are forcing certain, in a sense, it's almost like a James Bond movie set, in ancient Greece, because, it turns out that King Creon, who in the original version is a good sort of righteous king, he seems good and righteous, offering his daughter, but he's really doing it so that he can then end up killing off his son-in-law Jason and taking over his throne. And so he becomes another manipulative father who's doing that. And what's her name? Medea, when she ends up killing him, she does it for the wrong reason, but she does the right thing, because he would have usurped her kingdom, his kingdom.
Yeah, well, there's a heavy sense of irony, I suppose, in the plot too. I mean, it reminds me of the Jeffers retelling of Medea, where I suppose Creon and Jason are represented more or less as villains. I mean, although in the end, kind of what Medea does is quite kind of fantastically awful. Medea is sort of represented as kind of set upon and sympathetic ultimately. Whereas Jason isn't really, and Creon aren't really, although we figure out later that there are also these political machinations we're not aware of. Well, Jason is a sort of pathetic figure, more or less,
Yeah.
and there's no real kind of overt malice. So there's more of the sense of kind of this ironical sort of displacement where miscommunication, mishearing, as it were, people don't really know what's going on. That lack of perspective is really the driving force.
We don't find out until play 5. Medea seemingly gets away with her oldest surviving son, Thessalus, who is named after this woman from Thessaly that is in Jason's mind from play 1. So throughout the whole play, Jason has these idées fixées, if you will, about other women, whether it's Hera the goddess, whether it's this woman he doesn't know the name of. He names his son after. Very similar to the way Heracles is named after Hera in order to pacify her by Zeus. But in the main thing that I did in this play in regards to Medea is, like I said, it's a very sexist thing to make her the bad mother by killing her kids. So in order to get that around, I bring back Peleus, who in play 4, who hasn't been around since play 1, and he finds out that Medea's father, Aeetes, is the one who kills Acastus after Acastus betrays him. Acastus isn't lost. Acastus, we see at the end of play 3, is killed by Aeetes. So that sends Peleus sends assassins to kill Aeetes. They fail. Aeetes finds out about it, sends assassins back to kill Peleus, but instead they come upon the 2 kids, kill the 2 sons of Jason and Medea, which basically that would send a mother off her rocker, presumably, especially a woman who has mystical powers. And it plays further in to Aeetes and Medea's why they have pleasure. Because I gloss over, I don't go in play 3 when they've stolen the golden fleece and they're fleeing. There's a whole sub-story in the Argonautica and in various tellings about how Aeetes eventually sends his sons to go after Jason, and Medea ends up causing some trouble that kills one of her brothers and whatnot. But to me, that since I don't use those characters and we're dealing in a play where, this would be different had I done it in a novel form. I could have gone into that. Here, to simplify it, we have the father and the daughter. The daughter has betrayed the country. The father is a despot. They're at loggerheads, and his actions, end up killing his own grandsons. And this then gives, I think, a far more powerful motivation for the hatred that Medea feels, and why she would kill Creon and his daughter Glauca, who's basically just, a nice piece of ass that's being offered as a way for Creon to take over the kingdom. And so, and because putting aside the death of her sons in the original, she kills them and Creon and Glauca, and by making them being killed by her and having the boys killed by her own father, it adds, I think, realism into the motivations. We don't know exactly how she escapes, but we do find out in the 5th play, Jason escapes basically by switching his crown with that of the dead Thaddeus. Thaddeus has basically taken an arrow or something for him, and he sneaks out the back way. So he sneaks out underground, very similar. Orpheus is mentioned in the first couple of plays. Orpheus appears. He has a few minor scenes. A few other Castor and Polydeucus are there. Some other famous Greek characters. But he gets out by sneaking away and becoming part of the crowd, as the Corinthians, Creon and Glaucus are from Corinth. They then sack Iolcus, and in the actual play Medea, in all the versions, Jason and Medea somehow end up in Corinth, and I think it was better to set it in Iolcus and have Creon and them come and sack that city. So politically, the two biggest changes in that fourth play are giving real motivation to Medea, and then giving the political machinations of this prelude to the Trojan War of having Creon and his daughter come in and basically fuck a lot of things up.
Yeah, and Jason having to do this whole kind of rigmarole with Medea of like, oh no, I don't want to marry her, but it's politically expedient, and and her jealousy, as it were. I mean, that's an interesting bit of it adds a certain bit of dramatic tension, and because in most stories of Jason and Medea, we're told that Jason just becomes exhausted with Medea, right? That he realizes that she's kind of she's too foreign, she's too wild, she's a sorceress. By the time he gets back, he kind of wants a new bit of arse. Yeah. So this is a bit more interesting and has a bit more depth than just Jason being a shallow character.
Yeah, but like I said, with a lot of the Greek stuff, the quick clip pace of the stories where people become friends in just 2 or 3 lines, lifelong bosom buddies, you hear Jason is not the deepest character, but he's trying, and that gets the fact that he tries and fails makes him more interesting than just being the bad guy, because one of my favorite things that I do in here is Jason is talking about his own kingship, and he's talking to one of his assistants, or maybe no, it was when his father, the ghost of his father, comes to him, and his father says, you look at me as being the bad guy who ruined things. He says, but you killed and imprisoned more political prisoners than I ever did. And, Peleus only killed 2 people in his reign, and he reigned longer than both of us combined or something. I killed 77, whatever I gave it, and Jason killed 180-something political prisoners. So he's even more of a despot. And so that's, you get into that whole kind of Stalin-esque thing about, when do numbers matter? When does someone become evil? When they order the death of someone? And Jason, I guess, gets this at a certain level, but he still stumbles through life because he's still focused on his own end. And once his sons are dead, he basically gives up the ghost of existing. He's content to be a bum in the 5th play.
Yeah, so I suppose it's about kind of bringing a much needed sense of elegance and consequence, as it were, to this myth, which has always seemed to lack those sort of things, at least. Kind of the messiness, the weirdness, the absurdity of the original Argonauticus cycle, which everybody's always kind of been aware of, and has sort of been a challenge to people dealing with the myth. How do you make this whole chain of weird stuff work together as a coherent? And most people don't even do that. They'll take fragments, they'll take parts of the myth and deal. So, like for instance, my God, Harryhausen only really deals with the story of the fleece, and Jeffers and Aeschylus before him deal explicitly with the Medea story. So it seems a real challenge to get all these things working together, as it were, as a kind of seamless, tapestry.
Well, you have to know what to focus on. One of the great scenes in the Harryhausen film is the giant bronze man, whose name slips my mind off the top of the head.
Talos?
Talos, right? Talos, the great bronze man. And I remember, just to go back to that first time I saw it on the big screen, it was much scarier to see it in color. The blackness of that character's eyes, not because black is evil, but there's nothingness there. And then when he looks down at Heracles, and you see Heracles even running away, or Hercules in the movie running away with the Cassis, I think it is, and that's just a great scene. But the fifth play is probably my favorite play, since it's the one that I have the most freedom to do with, since it's set afterward. And basically, it's basically King Lear set in Greece, because instead of wandering around the heaths, Jason is shambling around a drunken bum, going through the garbage cans of that era, or whatever they did, the back alleys, the backs of taverns or pubs or whatever they had then, and eating this or that. And he's sort of a local joke, it seems, and this is too, in the final play, I bring in more characters, extras, people who are just walking. Jason has finally become part of the crowd. He is the man of the people by the end. But every so often he'll say, I was Jason of the Argonauts. And they're like, yeah, sure you were.
We also have the gods sort of, giving their commentary and sort of attempting, as it were, to sort of, ask, well, what's this all mean in the end? So what's this all come to? And sort of Hera's sort of asking Zeus, but also, I suppose, asking the audience to sort of sympathize with Jason, and sort of, and Zeus is saying, why should we? I mean, he came from nothing, and he didn't necessarily earn like his stature, his station, and now we should feel sorry for him because he wants all this stuff back. And so I suppose the gods are as well, they're trying to in their own terms sort of resolve kind of the story for us, or for themselves.
Well, Jason ends up basically finding the Argo, because the basic setup of the play is that his oldest son, the two youngest sons were killed. His oldest son was spirited away by Medea, Thessalus. He then basically redoes the whole Jason thing. He's taken away after the Corinthians sacked the city. He comes back as a young man, takes the city back, and he's the best of all the kings. He's the best. He's got the blood of Aeetes, he's got the blood of Aeson, he's got the blood of Jason, and he's the spiritual descendant, supposedly. He's the better king than Acassus would have been had he become king. And so he takes over. He's actually going to make a museum. I got that idea. There's a lot of, here in America, they have old warships, and they make floating museums out of these ships of death, basically. Let's see how people killed each other in the Second World War. Isn't that fascinating? But so the Argo is going to be restored, and this brings back, the whole Theseus, the ship of Theseus thing about, if they restore the Argo, is it really the Argo? And Thessalus, sends a messenger. Because apparently it's gotten back to the king in the big city. This is some podunk town that Jason is wandering around in. In the big city, it's gotten back there. There's some whack job who claims he's Jason. So Thessalus sends one of his messengers. The messenger, they go through a whole rigmarole, a pretty funny, interesting scene, I think. And he goes back and says that he can't he's not allowed to legally kidnap Jason back, but that the king will come to him. Muhammad coming to the mountain. Thessalus comes down to the small podunk town. He believes this is his father. They don't have genetic testing then, but he believes this is his father, and says, come on back. Let me take you back. You can be king emeritus. You can, you'll have your respect. I've redeemed the family name. And Jason basically says, well, maybe I will sometime, but he doesn't. He ends up, by the end of the play, seemingly he snuck back into town, and one night he's on the Argo, and the ghosts of Theseus and Heracles come to him. Now, one of the things I really like about the ending of the play is Heracles has now ascended to godhood. He briefly gives a 2 or 3 sentence answer about what his adventures since he left the play cycle earlier. You know, how he died and what. And by the end, though, it doesn't matter, because Heracles, the greatest of all the demigods, the greatest of all the ancient heroes, the most powerful, the most Christ-like, literally Christ. The Christ myth took stuff from Heracles and half a dozen other gods, but literally he just becomes an afterthought, and he just sort of, he's there on stage but doesn't say anything, and you end up with a dialogue between Jason and his younger self. Jason and his younger self, Chloe and Danny as Zeus and Hera, and basically the play ends with, you know, younger Jason, they're talking existentially, and then there's a blackout, and we just hear wood snap, boom, and silence, and then in the dark we just hear younger Jason's voice, basically, you know, talking about, you know, well, basically que sera, 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 and that's how it ends.
Then Chloe says, "Wow."
Yeah.
Yeah, there's also like this sort of spectral figure, sort of perhaps Death, who sort of beckons Jason, come, or
yeah,
you know.
and that I call him the figure. And you know where I got that from? From one of Jessica's favorite movies, Carnival of Souls. There's the figure.
Oh,
there's the figure of Death that keeps chasing the blonde, the beautiful blonde character who turns out to be dead, which, if you know that, and now you'll know that if you've seen this, if that is Death, is everything then something that's being looked back upon? Is who's really in charge here? Is it any of the mortals? Is it Hera? Is it Zeus? Is it Chloe? Is it Danny, the author? Or is it the figure?
Well, it's if like to sort of voice my own opinion here, it's got to be Danny, isn't it? Because all of this is, you know, we can see it diegetically is a play, and this takes place within the play. So like it's got to be Danny. But then that's me risking my own controversial opinion there. But to digress for a moment though, the name of the whole cycle, Argonauticus, I said I really liked it. It's It makes me think of Captain Nemo,
right? And I mentioned that in the play, Nemo, and Nemo in whatever language this one, in French, I think, means no one.
No one. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you can interpret that as you want, but this is one of the things with art that you need to do. You have to put a lot. You know, here in America we have bagels, and what they did was they would have salt bagels, they'd have sesame seed bagels, they'd have rye bagels. They put everything on. But what happened is, at the end of the day, they'd have a little bit of leftover of all the spices, and then they put them all together and make an everything bagel. And in art, you have to sort of do that too. Is you know, the idea of the figure, or the man, as they call it from Carnival of Souls, the figure of Zeus and Hera being played by actors who have been written by one of the actors, Danny, the author. The figure of Death, the whole inverting of certain things, the strengthening of other things.
So the Argonauticus is an everything bagel, Dan.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you try. I mean, and it's different. If you compared these 5 plays with the 5 plays of King Arthur, there's a fundamental difference. Is this is a much more, I think, bleak and nihilistic play, you know, series. But not nihilistic in a negative sense. Nihilism, it doesn't have to be negative. I mean, one can say that Jason accepts throughout, especially in the last half of this play, or the whole play. In fact, he basically accepts in the 5th play that he's going to die. He's going to die ignominiously. Will people remember him? There's the echo of, you know, the Percy Bysshe Shelley poem Ozymandias there. Who is going to remember all of these people? I think I even, in the 1st or 2nd play, I have Theseus or Heracles asking pretty much the same question as the Shelley poem. You know, who's going to remember us in 50 and 500 and 5,000 years? You know, it all blows away, kind of thing. And yet we see I think, very compelling characters. Even
obviously we don't know because like the myth lives on forever, doesn't it?
sure, but
And not to contradict you there, but like that's if anything, it's the proles and the peasants we forget. It's the heroes that we remember.
yeah, well, which is one of the reasons too, though. In the end, Jason wants to be a plebeian. He wants to be forgotten. He's. I think he even says at some point, he feels more of himself than he ever did on the throne. Just scavenging through the garbage of the day.
Yeah, so sort of a more banal existence, I suppose, a drudgery and what have you. I mean, it's yeah. I seem to recall a poem by Brecht where he says kind of like all the great pyramid. We remember sort of the pharaohs whom the pyramids were built to memorialize and what have you. But we're never going to remember all the slaves who lug up the giant bricks.
Yeah, people remember the architects; they don't remember the workers.
I mean, I suppose, in a sense, when I think of sort of Greek myths, like I also think of kind of, they are in a sense allegorical to some degree. I mean, they involve a kind of temporal displacement where we're supposed to be thinking about a larger societal context. I mean, even though in a way, a lot of that original intended allegorical import, so that illustrative quality, is unreconstructible to us. We have to, in a way, become social historian anthropologists to really make an attempt to do that. I mean, do you feel that there's a kind of urgent connection? I mean, like as it were, between what this play is representing, its space of mythic characters, and what is happening sort of today in our socioeconomic climate. I mean, I talk to all sorts of people, and they say this is the worst time ever, and blah blah blah. And you have your own ideas of history, I know from our previous conversations. But where does kind of this story of Jason fit into the stories that we are telling now? The kind of characters that we're discussing now.
Well,
it's a broad question.
As the writer of them, I can say that what I want to do is make it applicable for then, for now, for the future, to give enough leeway that you can slip something in and get something out of it. If you look at, I mean, and great works will do that. You don't have to live in 1860 and know a bit about the whaling industry to appreciate Moby Dick. You don't have to know about mid 20th century.
It's like you were saying. That's like you were saying in a previous conversation where we were talking about Moby Dick. A kind of modern analog for the people of the Pequod could be sort of the crypto entrepreneurs of today. People on Wall Street or what have you. That sort of thing. Like if you think about sort of the leaders and I suppose the political dynasties today. I mean, you have Putin and you have erstwhile Trump and what have you. I mean, these are kind of similarly, I suppose you could call them conflicted, slightly sort of figures struggling with history in a way, and with kind of their own sense of self-importance.
I think one of the things that if you try to put things into a modern context, you have to try to do what I was doing, and I think I succeed. I know I succeed with these plays and with other stuff I've done, is that you have to take the stuff that doesn't work and replace it with stuff that you have to. If you have a contraption that you want to restore, like these cable TV shows we have here in America, where someone finds a piece of junk in a junkyard and they spend $2,000 to restore something so they can sell it for $10,000 to some collector. That's what you need to do here with the art. Because if you don't do that, like with comic books, things become increasingly absurd and ridiculous. I was just reading, do you know what a Boltzmann brain is?
No.
Okay, so there was a guy in the late 19th century, I forget his first name, he was Eastern European, but named Boltzmann, and he came up with this idea that given the huge complexity of the universe, the 19th century idea of the universe, not even what we know now, which is far grander, given the complexity of the universe of his time, he thought it would be much more likely that spontaneously in a vacuum, a brain would appear, and this brain would fill itself its own backstory of its own life and its own universe, that was more likely than the universe itself coming into being and millions or billions of years going by and individuals having a society and whatnot. So it became a point of sort of ridicule for other scientists that they would refer to Boltzmann brains. Well, what's the odds of us living in a Boltzmann brain or being part of a Boltzmann?
Like a brain in a jar.
Yeah, what's the odds of that versus reality being so? And most people put it off. Now there are a handful of scientists today or philosophers, and this shows how far philosophy has fallen and why it's so far out of favor, who have taken this up as being somehow maybe even possible. Well, I don't want to get sidetracked in it, but this is the equivalent where you have writers or artists of some kind doing really absurd things. Like, for example, here in the U.S., there was a recent Pulitzer Prize-winning book 6-7 years ago, written by a black fellow, I forget the name of the guy, who wrote a book called The Underground Railroad, in which the Underground Railroad to get slaves from safe house to safe house, from the South to the North to Canada, to freedom in the 19th century, how this might have actually been an underground train. And this is the kind of just real stupid shit that happens in art, and it reminded me of the Boltzmann brain. And it only came to me yesterday or this morning when I woke up, because I had a dream of a person I knew, and this came to mind. I looked it up. I'm like, oh, that's what that meant. So you have to redo things, but you have to, I think, bring them into a kind of reality that people can associate with. Like I said, something can fail. Like I was just going to talk about Death of a Salesman, and how Death of a Salesman, you don't have to live in the mid-20th century and know about insurance sales then or now to appreciate that. But I think I might have mentioned to you before, I've said it before, I think one of the biggest failings of that play is the character of Biff Loman, fucking up his life for 20 years because he found his father with a hooker. It makes no logical sense. He should be angry at his father. He shouldn't take that anger and turn it inward towards himself. This is the kind of characterization that happens in a lot of the Greek tales, where we have these Julian Jaynes-like, zombie-like characters. It makes no rational sense for that character in the 20th century to do that to himself. But that in and of itself is not, while I think that's an error dramatically, it's not a Boltzmann brain kind of error where someone goes so over the top where this is all the imaginings of Biff Loman as he's a character from 5,000 years from now reading a book or something. So you have to take the stuff, the Medea thing, turn it around so that not only does it become more natural, but it loses the veneer, the patina of paternalism, of chauvinism, of sexism that is rife within the idea of her killing her own kids.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, what the thing that I was thinking of was, when I look at other people trying now to adapt Greek myth, and I already mentioned recently that there were these, I think around about 2009 to 2012, there were these big budget studio adaptations of, the Perseus myth of, ostensibly remakes of Clash of the Titans. And the way that they represented kind of myth, the mythic space of, classical heroes and what have you, was as superheroes, basically. They represented kind of, the gods and what have you, slinging lightning bolts with capes, and as action film stars, saving the world and all this sort of stuff. And it's just that I suppose, artistically, it's not very interesting to me. But anthropologically, sort of like sociologically, it is rather telling to think that kind of like the way in which we kind of make sense of that sort of stuff. Well, is on the one hand to sensationalize it, but also, I mean, that's the only way that we can kind of make that sort of stuff fit for a contemporary audience in our world as kind of a big spectacle. That in a way it's too abstract. We have to make it into something basically, like some basically that the old gods become literally more like those Jack Kirby alien superhero gods in our retelling of them, and that seems almost like, as you were saying with your analogy about the Underground Railroad, an extremely exquisitely literalist move, artistically.
Well, what I said earlier, I said about the use of drama. If I was gonna do a novel, it's easy to go big in a novel because you can do just about anything. But within drama, and I'll go back to the Talos. Talos appears in a scene that's only maybe about 10 sentences long. We just hear him and the characters running, and we just hear. And I even said it has to sound like the beginning of the first Godzilla movie in 1954. Just boom, 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 the foot. So the giant stuff, the big stuff, the spectacle has been reduced to just some, someone banging on a wash tub or whatever might be used by some local theater to give the effect of a giant metal. So even though I've done a lot of reworking, you bring it down to the human level, and this is where it gets to the idea of picking the right medium for what you do. If I had wanted to try, let's say, if in 5-10 years I go back to poetry again, maybe if I hadn't written this play, I might say, well, maybe I should redo the Argonautica in a poetry form. But no, this was the right at the time. This is you asked earlier, why do you do this here? Are you repeating yourself? But this was the right form to do it in because of that. Because drama forces one to look inward at the characters, and so that the giant bronze man, we don't even see a giant foot, on stage just going up and down, boom, boom, boom. We just hear like boom, boom, boom. But we're mostly in the minds of the author. We're in the minds of the gods that with their playthings. We're in the minds of Jason, and so on and so forth. So this was the right medium.
It's especially germane to the space of theatre as well. I mean, I feel like perhaps we, or at least I tend to neglect that in our conversations about your plays, sort of the specific discontinuous space of theatre, and kind of the whole, the fact that this is happening on a stage, not a screen, but through actors and what have you. And I think it's interesting to see you thinking about that element of mise en scène within the theatre proscenium. You are more often than not, you do tend to go for quite, or what should we say, sort of Spartan kind of stage setting. You choose to imply rather than show, sort of, and again, maybe that's a question of economy, of kind of like, you don't want to require too much of materially, you don't want to require too much of the theatre production or the actors, but also it's perhaps better to sort of leave open things.
Well, it all depends too, because I've done this in novels too. In my book, the one where I have the Jessica characters taking away the levels, I have some scenes that start off with things in the middle of a scene. Something happens. We're just told briefly about it, but the action that would be central in a film adaptation, especially a Hollywood film adaptation, has already happened. Now we're in the interstices between the action. In my big long sci-fi book where I redo a Philip Dick short story there, I sometimes have the captain, coming back to the spaceship. We spent the last 3 days underground battling the so-and-so aliens. Now we're back at the ship. And that's how it starts. we don't need to see that. Because that was dealing with heroes, anti-heroes, superheroes. We don't need to see every
Yeah.
incident that this does. And in the same way, the form of drama, the theater, enforces that upon you. Very rarely, I
It's
think.
interesting as well because I mentioned that sort of allegory was about temporal displacement. Irony is more a sense of literal displacement. Like whereas, like as you were saying, we see sort of the aftermath of events and such. I mean, but that's also something quite interesting about the Jason myth. There's a weird sense of anticlimax to a lot of these. I mean, a lot of the actual episodes of them visiting islands. A lot of weird, kind of slightly anticlimactical kind of stuff happens. I mean, like on one island, they just kind of sleep with a bunch of like smelly women, and then in another episode, they kind of they like run away from something. So it's kind of this weird, kind of ironical thing where a lot of the time, the central action, as you were saying, either happens off stage or it's sort of implied. And what we have to deal with is, as you were saying, sort of the interiority of the drama, as it were, people sort of ruminating or making sense of kind of what has just happened.
Well, in the original Argonautica, there's maybe a dozen, 15 or whatnot episodes where they go to islands and do this and do that. In a sense, almost a precursor to the Odysseus stuff.
Yeah.
But I gloss over most of that. I do actually, the island where Jason ends up going to meet and sleep with the women, I don't deal with that here. But I actually, in my book on the hero, which is a Western novel set in Texas in 1850, I do have a scene where those characters do meet a town filled with women that are up in the mountains here in Texas, in the Davis Mountains. And so you have to know where to use those types of things too. And if the essence of the play is to get to a more realistic reason as to why Medea killed the kids, a more realistic version of Jason as to why he does what he does and is so willing to give up the ghost at the end, you have to know what to use and what not to use. And you can assume, if you know the various mythos, just like you can assume with the Arthurian myth, you don't have, in the Arthurian plays, for example, I just gloss over the fact Queen Guinevere says, yeah, I had a one-night stand with Lancelot, and it was, he wasn't that good in bed, basically. That's a way of dealing with the fact, as presented in many other versions of the tales, but to put it in its own place, because that's not important with what I was doing. And in the same way, it's not important to go to a dozen different islands and see the various stuff. I have one scene where they meet the Bebrycians, which is, I think, if I recall, it's on the Anatolian side, the south side of the Black Sea or the Inhospitable Sea, and we get a little bit of one of Tiphys, the guy who's the original not the oarsman, the guy who steers the craft. He ends up being killed. But that's just to give one example that they do go on many adventures, but we don't have to see. We can imagine that and the clashing rocks, which introduces Medea. Those are really the only two out of the dozen or more adventures that I deal with in the play, because it is interior, and it's more important how Jason and Medea and all the characters deal with what happens than actually seeing what happens. Again, we don't have to have $1 million stage production to see the giant foot of Talos crushing a few of the Argonauts.
I mean, I suppose kind of the theme of this conversation, if not the plays, something that kind of is this sort of question of iconography, I suppose, or auto-iconography, things repeating, stories being retold, and this larger question of, why retell them? Why remake anything at all? And, I suppose you could ask this of any one of your mythic plays, like why, what changes in the retelling? And for me, for me, kind of it is kind of that kind of the elegance and um, the pathos, the bathos, even kind of that kind of you can bring into the story. But it's also I'm left with this other question, I suppose, which is like why heroes really? Why there are lots of fabulistic stories. There are lots of things that. What is it about the hero? I mean, because you've done this in your novels too, where you've sort of dealt with these various. I suppose you could call them archetypes of the hero, the superhero, the cowboy, the super spy, as it were. Heroes, I suppose, are a staple of literature and of drama. And we have endless fascination and take endless delight in sort of recapitulating those tropes of the heroic and deconstructing, as it were. Like, what is it about the hero that kind of fascinates? I mean, I suppose not just you, but what do you think it is about the hero that fascinates?
It would depend on the hero. It's not heroes, it's individual hero. I mean, there are certain people I wouldn't ever want to write about. People would consider Winston Churchill a hero. He doesn't interest me. People would consider there's any number of war figures from the Second World War. Audie Murphy, who became a movie star in the 50s. He was a guy who was a heroic figure. Sergeant York from the First World War. They
But
are considered.
is history a parade of heroes? I mean, you joke rather ironically, or Zeus slash Danny jokes that perhaps call me the last great defender of the great man of history theory. Like, is that what you're doing? Are you defending the great man of history?
Well, I think there are great men, great movers, but I think it's also a combination of the tides of history too. I mean, if you removed Adolf Hitler, we probably would still have had a major war. Maybe it would have come 10 years later, 1951 or 52. It might not have coalesced as quickly without as charismatic a figure. If you remove Stalin and if Trotsky had taken over, would he have been that much better realistically? I mean, I think.
What do great figures, heroes, as it were, sort of make manifest? I mean, like, is it fate? I mean, because again, that you grapple with this concept of fate in so much of your work, Dan.
Well, yeah, I don't believe in fate. And the biggest divide of that would be the difference between art and science. Science is the living embodiment of the forces of history and nature, over being greater than any individual. Because, like I said, if you remove Darwin, you still got Wallace. You remove Newton, you still got Leibniz, who makes calculus, and so on and so forth. But if you remove Kubrick, you'll never have 2001. If you remove Melville, no Moby Dick. If you remove Shakespeare, pick one of his top 5 or 6 plays. You won't have that. So, in reality, history is a mixture of the both. I mean, that's just obvious. There are people who wrench away. Without Walt Whitman, you would not have had a lot of the poets of. You wouldn't have had the Eliots and the Pounds to react against him. You wouldn't have had Dickinson getting published probably. But you would have had. But maybe later on, it might have taken another 50 or so years. You would have had poetry flowering and then collapsing on itself again, as it has in the last 40 years.
So perhaps the real theme or the real subject is history.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you're dealing with myth, history, in a sense, almost always becomes myth. I mean, Douglas MacArthur was a real person, but his "I shall return" is as mythic a statement as you could make. And he wasn't himself a great general. He wasn't a terrible general as people have, but he's not in a league with the top 20 generals all time. He was just a guy who was a good politician within armed clothes. But again, "I shall return." I mean, that's as mythic a statement as any military leader has ever made.
Mm. But yeah, I mean, perhaps history as well. Kind of, we can also we were talking about sort of the ancient conceptualizations of history as sort of as a sort of shall we say, sort of a post-lapsarian kind of thing, a thing of sort of decreasing greatness, and sort of modern history as something which is progressive, progressive temporality. I mean, but perhaps we're caught between these ideas of cyclic and linear history as well. I mean, what do you? I mean, is history something that you think of as linear, or is it something that where we see, or are we going to see things coming around again and again forever? Is it continuity, or is it continuity with disruption?
I think history is like a coil. The coil progresses, but not as fast as it would if it was just a straight pipe. Things go around and around, and right now we're at a low ebb here in the U.S. and certainly probably the world with global warming. Figures like Putin and the Chinese communists still in charge. People like the Trumps and the Bidens, who are feckless idiots in Biden, and active agents of idiocy in Trump. But I mean, I think you will come around.
That's a very interesting thing, and I've had conversations myself with people where they're talking about sort of history as a spiral. That's very a coil, you said.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because you have a compressor coil. Things move forward, but they don't move as fast. I think it was Carl Sagan in Cosmos who opined something like, imagine if, I forget, was it the Persians who sacked the library at Alexandria? Was it the Persians who did it? I'm not certain. But when the sack of the library of Alexandria, and something like, was it 60,000 or 600,000 scrolls were lost, not only the art, but in the ancient world, there were certain cultures that were able to make batteries that could last almost as long as batteries made 100 years ago. Imagine, would we be out in the stars now if whoever barbarians or Persians or whoever it was, the Phoenicians, I don't know, who sacked the Library of Alexandria, if they hadn't sacked that, would we be 500 years further along in our process? Would the people in 1500 be like us? Would they have had cell phones in 1522? Who knows?
So like enlightenment, but also counter enlightenment, iconoclasm, as it were.
Yeah, unless you're one of those people who believe that there was that the Middle Ages never happened. You ever hear that theory about someone? Some people think that from the year 624 to like 987 never really happened or something. People come up with all of these Boltzmann brain.
Yeah, all this
is
weird
the Boltzmann
sort of
brain
crypto calendar stuff.
But
yeah, well, I think that's actually an interesting note to sort of leave it on, sort of pulling back and talking about sort of the tapestry of history. And so, like, as we usually do in our conversations, I kind of want to pull it back to kind of where you're kind of going from here, Dan. Kind of, you mentioned your book about your cats. Anything else in the forefront of your mind?
Well, I'm gonna do that next, the kids' book, and hopefully you can do some drawings for me. We'll talk about that once I get it. That'll probably take 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
And then I've got other ideas for a World War II novel that I want to do. A novel about another professional wrestler from the 1970s named what's it? I got a Superstar Billy Graham. But then also, a lot of things come along. I still have to finish my last musical. I've done 2 of them. I got to do the third one, and I've got to set some time aside because they take longer, because I have to pick the songs and then craft the story around the songs. And then I've got other plays. I mean, I've got plenty of ideas. I'll never run out.
I haven't read your musical plays, I admit. Like, so are they like jukebox musicals then? You're taking pre-existing songs and sort of stringing things around them?
Yeah, and I also have alternate scenes where, because most of the songs that I use are rock songs, and they are copyrighted, but I also then have alternate scenes using classical or non-public domain, or public domain works rather.
I would love to see you write an operetta at some point. I mean, like, I know no one's going to tell you what to do, but like that seems like an interesting sort of in your
Well,
working through those.
they are de facto rock operas. I mean, you know, and the difference is I'm taking from an era, a time and place, and different. You know, I don't have to do like Tommy and the Who and write all the songs about the thing. I can. I mean, I had, for example, there's a song by a group called Ram Jam called Black Betty. And I used that song as the intro song for a black prostitute that I named Betty. And then there's a song by the Danish, no, the Dutch group, Candy's Going Bad, the guys who did Twilight Zone and um, uh, now I'm stepping into the Twilight Zone, and but a song called Candy's Going Bad, and I have a character named Candy because of that. So that now someone would, if that play was produced now, you know, I'd get some lawsuit to say you can't, that character is based upon our song. Well, yeah, but the character herself is not. You know, I totally make it something unique, but
Transformational, yeah.
Yeah, but that's one of these days we should do a whole thing on public domain and
Yeah,
copyright.
that's a whole conversation in itself for sure.
Yeah, because copyright law in the U.S. and in the world is just ridiculous. I mean, you know, it's so in favor of Walt Disney companies and these companies that, you know, Walt Disney. I mean, fucking Mickey Mouse should have been in copyright, you know, 20 years after Walt Disney died by 1980s. You know, same thing with James Bond, same thing with Batman. Yeah, you can use Mickey Mouse as your corporate logo, but that doesn't mean that, you know, I mean, imagine people, well, we will get into it another time.
Yeah, and so you've done you've done the musical. Are there other forms of theatre as well that might be tantalizing for you? I mean, I'm thinking like what are the various permutations of sort of stage drama? There's the musical. There's also, I suppose. Have you thought about like silent, anything that could be silent, anything without dialogue?
Well, I mean, there's the famous Beckett. It's not even a play where he's in a black thing and he's crawling around. I mean, I do have a couple of plays. My play.
You have certain elements within plays that sort of like seem to like reminiscent of those more kind of avant-garde things. But like I'm thinking of something like, you know, like Cantor's The Dead Class or something, you know, like something that would be almost entirely down to gesture and sort of, you know, stage direction.
Well, yeah, I've not read that, so I don't know that. But I mean, I do have things that are quasi absurdist. I mean, I did a play called "Lo Lord Thou Ridest" from a Hart Crane poem. The title comes from, about a hurricane that hits in Hawaii, and there seem to be some kind of extraterrestrial creatures afoot.
The most surreal play I've ever read from you is I forget the name, forgive me, but it was reminiscent of the Marianne Badge film by you know, Rob Grier.
Oh, the one where they're running around a hotel and the guy.
Yes.
Yeah. I forgive myself because I don't remember all the titles. I like making good titles, but I can like with these. I mean, just to give you an idea, we haven't even said the title of the play. So Argonauticus 1.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let me see. Let me bring that up here because off the top of my head. So Argonauticus 1 is a dream animal, and it has an epigraph by Lauren Isley, who appears in the Robinson Jeffers play. Then Argonauticus 2 is called, also has an Isley essay, A Shadow Among Shadows. Argonauticus 3 is called A Grace of His Own, and that has a John Donne epigraph to it. The Medea play, number 4, is called, and it has a Hart Crane epigraph, A Fleshless Door, which is, I like the implications of them going somewhere else. And the final play, the 5th one, which is sort of Jason doing King Lear, is bent towards some flashing, which is also from a Hart Crane poem, and it has an epigraph from The Broken Tower by Crane. So
you always pick great titles, I must say.
well, that's the thing. But yeah, to me, they're just the handles for the other people. For me, it's the first, second, third, fourth, fifth play. It's easier to remember. You know, when you write so goddamn much, it's hard to remember. Like I'll get people who'll email me this. I don't know if you saw. I had forwarded around. Some gal recently read A Norwegian in the Family, and you know, she said, "Oh, it was good." This I can't even go into all of it. I was sort of glad because a lot of times people will be like, Dan, I read the Vincetti Brothers, and you know that scene where this happens. That what were you thinking when you wrote it? I'm like, I barely remember the fucking scene, you know, because I've written probably published works probably 20, 25 million words or something, you know,
Yeah.
and it's like, you know, I can't remember every scene. There are some scenes with Paulie or Big Frank or Jason here that I remember, but come back in 5 years, you know, if I look back at the first 5 or 10 plays I wrote, I remember certain things that I was doing. And if I were to reread them, things would come back to me. But that's
why I say you're the hardest working man, the hardest working artist alive, man. I mean, you inhuman, superhuman in the way that you're able to churn this stuff out.
But the thing, and I think I mentioned this to you before, one of the most important things for every artist to know is to learn how to forget. And I've told this to many an artist, is that once you've done something and you're satisfied with it, it's done. Forget how you did it. Forget what you did. Remember the techniques of how to do things. Don't remember the details, because then you'll start repeating yourself. And that's one of the ways to consciously not repeat yourself. When I do this, if you look, I don't know if I've sent you, have you read the 2 musicals or not? If you look at them, they're quite different. But
I haven't read them so far.
Okay.
No.
But yeah, so you always want to just move beyond it and let things lie and go on to the next thing, and so that you come with fresh eyes to something. So that if you're doing Jason, if I ever decided to do a trilogy of Odysseus plays, the Odyssey in a trilogy, I won't go back to the same thing. You have to find something in Odysseus that's different, you know, than what Jason was doing. Otherwise, you're just repeating yourself and you're not showing the growth. And too many artists get stuck in that rut. You have to go on. If you have a blue period, you need to go on to a pink period. You need to go on to a more abstract period. You need to get, you know, into a neo-realistic period or something. Or what is a photorealistic, not neorealism. Well, if you're a filmmaker, go to try neorealism.
Well, that sounds like a great place to leave it off on then, Dan. Like
Okay.
Dan's in his neo-real period or what have you. But yeah, thanks so much for talking to us, Dan, about the Argonauticus series.
And
thanks
you
again
for
just
talking with
making
me.
the work that you do.
And thank you for being interested in it. I admire you, and you're a good friend to my wife, Jessica. So thank you.